Okay, so here's something wild. The Eastland disaster killed more people than the Titanic did in some passenger categories, and it happened in the middle of Chicago, in broad daylight, with the ship still tied to the dock.
That's such a shocking comparison. The Titanic is this massive, iconic tragedy. But the Eastland? It's barely remembered, even though 844 people died. And it wasn't out in the middle of the ocean. It was right there in the Chicago River.
Exactly. And what makes it even more haunting is how ordinary that day started. It was July 24th, 1915, a Saturday morning. Thousands of workers from Western Electric's Hawthorne Works factory, along with their families, were gathering for a company outing. They were headed to Michigan City, Indiana for a picnic, a day of games, food, and music. For many of these families, this was a rare treat, something they'd been looking forward to for weeks.
And these weren't wealthy travelers or tourists. These were working-class families, many of them immigrants. Czech, Polish, German, Irish, Scandinavian, and others. They weren't boarding a luxury liner. They were just looking for a day away from the factory. It's heartbreaking to think how quickly that excitement turned into tragedy.
The Eastland itself had a history, though, and not a good one. It was launched in 1903, designed for speed on the Great Lakes. But its design, a relatively narrow hull with multiple decks rising above the waterline, made it more sensitive to weight distribution. Stability was an issue from the very beginning.
And when we talk about stability, we mean the ship's ability to right itself if it starts to lean. If the center of gravity is too high, the ship becomes less stable. And if it leans too far, it reaches a point where it can't recover. The Eastland was dangerously close to that point for years.
That's right. In fact, just a year after it entered service, in 1904, the Eastland leaned so severely during boarding that passengers panicked. It didn't capsize that time, but it was a clear warning sign. And there were other incidents over the years. The ship developed a reputation for listing, leaning to one side, and yet it kept operating.
That's the part that really gets me. Each time the Eastland listed and didn't capsize, it seemed to reinforce this false sense of security. People started to think, oh, that's just what the ship does. It always rights itself. It's that dangerous mindset of normalizing warnings because nothing catastrophic has happened. Yet.
And it wasn't just the ship's design. Over time, modifications were made that added weight or altered how the ship sat in the water. Concrete flooring was installed in some areas, more equipment was added above the waterline, and passenger permissions changed. All of these factors compounded the ship's already fragile stability.
And then, after the Titanic disaster in 1912, new safety regulations were introduced. The Seamen's Act of 1915 required passenger ships to carry more lifeboats and life-saving equipment. On paper, it was a reasonable response to the Titanic's lack of lifeboats. But for the Eastland, which already had stability issues, the added weight of this equipment, 15 to 20 tons, was disastrous.
It's one of those tragic ironies. The very equipment meant to save lives in an emergency contributed to the conditions that caused this disaster. But it's important to point out that the lifeboats weren't the sole cause. The Eastland's instability was a known issue long before these new regulations came into play.
And that's the real problem, isn't it? Safety was treated as a checklist. Enough lifeboats? Check. Authorized passenger capacity? Check. Inspection certificate? Check. But no one was asking the deeper systemic question. Could this ship, with its design and history, safely carry this arrangement of people and equipment?
That brings us to the morning of the disaster. Boarding began around 6:30 a.m. The Eastland was tied up along the south bank of the Chicago River near the Clark Street Bridge. Families crossed onto the ship carrying baskets, coats, and small children. The cool, damp weather likely encouraged many to stay below deck.
By the time the ship was fully loaded, there were over 2,500 passengers and crew aboard. It was near its authorized capacity, which is important to note. This wasn't a case of illegal overcrowding. The issue was that the authorized capacity itself may have exceeded what the ship could safely handle.
As the ship filled, it began to lean. At first it listed toward the wharf, then shifted back and eventually leaned to port, away from the dock. Passengers moved across the decks, trying to adjust, and the crew attempted to manage the list using the ship's ballast system. But the situation was deteriorating.
And then, at 7:28 a.m., the Eastland rolled. It happened so quickly. People on the upper decks were thrown into the river or onto the exposed side of the hull. Inside, it was chaos. Furniture, luggage, and people were all thrown to one side. Staircases became vertical walls. Doorways were submerged. The ship's architecture, designed for an upright vessel, became a series of traps.
What's especially haunting is how close the ship was to safety. The river was shallow enough that the Eastland rested on the bottom before fully submerging. Part of the hull remained above water. But for those trapped inside, the proximity to the surface didn't matter. Steel walls separated them from air and rescue.
Rescue efforts began immediately. Boats came alongside the hull, ropes were thrown, and people were pulled through windows. Welders cut into the steel to reach those trapped inside. But time was the enemy. The air in the submerged compartments ran out quickly, and the transition from rescue to recovery began.
By the end, 844 lives were lost. Families were shattered. Entire neighborhoods and workplaces were devastated. And yet, despite the scale of the tragedy, the Eastland disaster has largely faded from national memory.
There are so many reasons for that. The victims were mostly working-class immigrants, and their stories didn't command the same attention as, say, the Titanic's wealthy passengers. The disaster also occurred during a tumultuous time in history, with World War I and the sinking of the Lusitania dominating headlines.
And the story itself lacks a clear villain or dramatic narrative. There's no iceberg, no distant ocean, no final wireless message, just a series of systemic failures. A ship with known problems, regulations that didn't account for the vessel's unique issues, and a complacency that allowed the danger to persist.
It's a stark reminder of how disasters often unfold. The Eastland didn't have to cross an ocean to reach catastrophe. It carried catastrophe with it to the dock. And the warnings were there all along. They just became part of the background noise, something familiar and easy to ignore.
And that's perhaps the most unsettling part. The Eastland disaster wasn't an unforeseeable accident. It was a danger that society had learned to overlook. And in the end, 844 lives paid the price.